And I think we should be back. If you're just hopping back on, our internet had a massive issue. It was not a DDoS attack tonight. The internet just went out. We were having a little bit of rain going on outside. And of course, being in Alabama and using Spectrum as an internet provider, it will shut off whenever a slight gust of wind comes by. So hopefully, we're not going to have that problem for the rest of the night. And just allow me real quick to set up some of my stuff in the background, and then we'll be right back to the show. And so if you're seeing OBS right now, that should be switching here in a second to the map, which I'll just do right now real quick for everyone hopping back on. And let me get to the studio so that way I can run the control room. Whole bunch of cool techno stuff is going on in the background that you cannot see, but I can promise you it's there. So let me just go through and open up that control room and then go down here and click on this. And so a lot of y'all should be back. It's been a long time no see, eh? Like 4 minutes. And so hopefully that wasn't too big of a disruption, everyone. Once again, sorry on our end. It was not a DDoS attack. I am going to make that clear. It was actually an internet outage. Our internet got completely shut off because apparently something happened outside with the rain a little bit. And so our internet just went, and it just died. So, oh, and also to address Kaltenberg, thank you very much for the $20 super chat. But we already do have a VPN. I'm not going to say which one, but we do have one, and it's done us pretty well so far. That's part of our security features that we have going on in the background. But I also did a lot of research with the security side of things and made sure that no one could really shut down the stream. And that's why, along with the VPN, when anyone DDoS attacks the streams now, we have a brief bit of connectivity issues, but then we just kind of crest over the wave, and then the stream runs back to normal. And so I'm going to give it just a minute for everyone to come back. We currently have 800 people back in here. Quite the number, because the stream's only been running for 2 minutes. But we're going to give it just a little bit longer, so that way everyone can come back.
And also, folks, please be sure to hit that like button again. Unfortunately, when the stream restarts, we lose all of our likes, which is horrible, because all of you spent your time putting in the likes on the last one. So if you would, please just hit that new like button, and hopefully we can get that number back up there again.
Now, I'm going to tell y'all a quick little story, because we're going to wait just about a minute or two before we begin the news again, just to make sure the connectivity stays okay, and also to allow people to get back in here. But I'm going to tell y'all a little story about an internet service provider in our area called Spectrum. And much like a lot of you, y'all most likely have a monopoly that provides your internet access. Of course, there's a couple of options to internet. You can get a dish installed. Now there's Starlink, which is kind of making its way over here. But much like your water and your electricity, you will most likely just have one internet service provider. And here in Alabama, for most people, that internet provider is Spectrum. And Spectrum is the literal worst internet provider that you can have anywhere in the world. I'm not trying to trash on the techs that work at Spectrum or anything like that. They're all great people. But Spectrum, as a company, does a very bad job at trying to make sure that their infrastructure is good. Usually it falls apart just constantly. I mean, like, you can walk into a barbershop and try and get a haircut, and the internet is just down for the whole city, and so they can't even access things like Square or anything like that to charge you for the haircut. Sometimes it's unfortunate stuff, but, I've always run into a lot of techs due to all of the internet issues Spectrum just inherently has, and a lot of techs come out here and try and fix some of the issues, because sometimes it is just our house, not the whole network, and they're always incredibly nice, and I feel sorry for them, because much like us as consumers of the product, they really only have one choice. If they want to have a job with an internet service provider in Alabama, it's Spectrum or nobody. And I hate that for them. And I kind of wish there was competition with an internet service provider here in Alabama, so that way Spectrum would at least try and up its game in light of competition. So with that, I hope you all have enjoyed the fireside chat. And I see Steelworks Media saying Spectrum is better than Xfinity. I don't know a lot about Xfinity, but I'll take your word for it, because usually whenever you have a monopoly in any category, it's never really good. One of the few times I would say that is sometimes the electrical companies do have their shining moments. Like, I will say that Alabama Power, by and large, is a pretty good power company, at least here in Alabama, talking about my local experience. But other companies like the Tennessee Valley Authority are known as very shady people. Anyways, welcome back to the stream, everyone. And we're now going to start back on the news once again, and we're going to continue off where we were. And so, here's the video of the big gun, big recoil. And we can see here that this time the video actually loaded because we have internet access. So that's good to know. And you can see that actually may be a 50 cal. I can't really tell you for certain. It's not the M82 I'm used to seeing, but it might be. I'm not going to give it just completely slam it as not being one. I might be wrong if I say that. But anyways, here's a video of this thing firing. And it pushed him back a pretty good ways. And he looks like he's a little awestruck by the firepower of that rifle. And I would have to agree as well. 50 caliber rifles or anything larger than that's shooting an actual modern caliber, does have a pretty decent kick to it, and it's always really fun to shoot. Now I'll say that, but sometimes you can be a little dazed from it because you're just like, dang, that was a huge recoil. And of course, I'm not saying that it literally throws you into like a psychosis or anything. It's just that every once in a while when you shoot those things, you just have to process the firepower that's behind one of those. But they're very impressive nonetheless. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on to our next bit of news, where we can then see the Russian losses for the day. And while we actually look at those losses, which I'm going to leave on screen here for just a second, please bear with me, everyone. I'm going to make sure to put out an announcement on my YouTube community page to let everyone know that a new stream is up, because I usually never give a follow-up to that kind of stuff, and I believe that may be leaving a lot of people in the dark. So I'm going to put a message, stream is back up, ! And post. And so that should get out to a decent amount of people, and hopefully they will hop back on. I want to make sure that everyone doesn't miss the news, because it's incredibly annoying whenever this kind of stuff does happen. Anyways, now it's time to get on to the Russian losses for the day. The Russians have lost another 150 men. Of course, these aren't just wounded, these are the killed only. 36,500. A nice round figure. Of course, it's not really nice when you think about it, but it is a round figure. We can see that they've also lost an additional 6 tanks today, finally rounding off the figure to 1,600, which is getting around 50% of the Russian tanks that are active and usable. We can also see that they've lost 3,789 armored personnel vehicles. That's getting pretty close to being a rounded number. Give it one more day, it might be. We can see that they've lost another 6 artillery pieces today, bringing that number up to 812. 247 MLRSs, no new ones today. They've lost 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems, probably a total of $30 million lost in those 2 anti-air systems alone, bringing that number up to 107. They have not lost any new planes today, nor helicopters, but the losses they've already taken in both of those areas has been significant. They've lost 15 boats, no new ones today. 4 additional drones were lost. Of course, 14 more supply trucks and fuel trucks were lost, which is always a great number to see. Always happy to see those numbers, because 14 trucks, I think we went over the numbers an incredibly long time ago, and to supply a whole entire battalion tactical group from dead dry of everything, dry of ammunition, fuel, and all of that, it takes a convoy of around 30 vehicles. And we can see that the Ukrainians today were able to knock out a whole half of a convoy that would be supplying a whole BTG from dead empty. And while that's not knocking out a large amount of BTGs from getting their supplies for the day, that's still whittling away. If we did the calculations off of a BTG needing, say, 30 vehicles at the maximum to resupply from dead empty daily, and we've seen that 2,648 military supply trucks and fuel trucks have been knocked out, we can take that number, 2,648, and divide it by 30, and that means that 88.3 battalion tactical groups have been deprived of getting any kind of supplies from an actual military truck. And so those 88, or really 84 battalion tactical groups, because while it's a fraction of one, that battalion tactical group still has to get the supplies somehow. Pretty much 89 battalion tactical groups are having to get supplied either by civilian vehicles, or they're lacking supplies in general until the sparse amount of supply vehicles can finally get around to them and supply them as well. And finally, we've seen that Ukraine has shot down a whopping 9 cruise missiles today, bringing the number up to 153. Once again, incredible losses that the Ukrainians have been inflicting on the Russians, and with losses like these, one always has to beg the question, how much longer can the Russians go? As far as we know, the Russians will keep on going until they're whittled down to non-existence. But the real question is, what imaginary line have the Russians drawn in hypothetical losses where once it crosses that line, the war is then unattainable for them and not worth the continued expenditure of lives and equipment? We don't know that number right now, and of course, trying to guess it would be something very asinine to do because it could be any figure. But these numbers are just getting incredibly high, and I just don't know how much longer they could last. They've already lost 50% of their tanks. I would assume probably around 30 to 35% of their armored personnel vehicles, and then almost 1 in every 4 helicopters in the entire Russian armed forces. And you've just got to assume at some point they can't continue on with these kinds of losses. So we're going to wait and see if eventually they do come to that point. But with that, we have now rounded out our location unknown news. And so now it's time to move on to everyone's favorite bit. It's the bit that everyone waits for, and I know everyone loves it, the question segment. So we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat, and after we answer those 3 questions, we'll then be moving on to the Belgorod area and the entirety of the Donbas area. That will include Luhansk and Donetsk today, and then after that, we'll be moving on into our last our last news segment of the night before we get on to our next question segment. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, and it is now time for round 1 of the question segment. So first up, we have a $100 super chat from Extreme Rider 25, who says, Slava Ukraine, Enforcer, and Enforcer Matt. I've been watching your streams like non-stop for the past month or so, and I always look forward to them. Keep it up, and never stop doing what you do.
Well, of course, I thank you so much for the massive amount of support because it does help us to keep these things going. And also, I would like to say I thank you so much for appreciating what we do because I'll be honest, regardless of whether it's a DDoS attack or the internet going out, that is incredibly stressful on my end because I know, one, that a lot of people will just not be able to get the news tonight. And then second, it throws a lot of stress on me because I have to go and rebuild the stream from the ground up in the setup to then go and run it again. And I have to do that within a very short amount of time and also notify everyone that this stuff is shut down. And so I thank you so much for the support because it helps us to keep on running the streams and it also helps us to keep on getting through stuff like that and try and make sure that the news gets out to everyone. And so thank you once again for the support. It does mean a lot to us. And also, Slava Ukraini. And also, you're a fairly new viewer, having only watched since about day 100. So I hope you've been enjoying it so far, and I hope you eventually go back and watch all of the 100 other streams that were ran before you hopped on in rewind, because those are pretty fun. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and I thank you so much once again for the support.
And next up, we have a $20 super chat from Douglas Newman, who says, great job, guys. My question is, can the HIMARS that Ukraine has shot the longer range rockets to if they were to get some?
The range that they'd be able to shoot them, as far as I know, is something like 250 miles. Yes, it would be 250 miles, I do believe. And so you could get the idea that with the 250-mile range, which for some reason in Europe, 250 miles seems so much bigger than in the United States. And it does make sense because if you come to Alabama, like for example in Montgomery, and you measure out 250 miles, it's actually still a considerably long distance. I don't know why it seems so much smaller in the States. But in Europe, you could get the idea that from Kyiv alone, if you put it HIMARS in Kyiv, and it had one of the maximum range rockets of 250 miles, that thing could actually touch out and reach Belgorod pretty much all the way from Kyiv. So that kind of gives you a perspective of how far the range is. And that means that from Zaporizhzhia, you could practically hit anything. You could reach out and hit Donetsk, you could reach out and hit Luhansk, you could hit Kherson, Melitopol, Sevastopol, Kerch, almost Krasnodar, it's very close, Rostov-on-Don, Belgorod. I mean, if you set up HIMARS with the longest range rockets from Zaporizhzhia and they were firing from there, you would be able to hit anything in the world that you could imagine pretty much that was on the front lines. And so I hope that does answer the question, because if they were able to get those kinds of rockets, the answer to that question is they'd be able to hit anything that's currently on the battlefield. And so with that, we're going to be moving on to the next question, and I thank you once again for the support. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and up next we have a $20 super chat from Telmed, who says Putin promised to give his soldiers a break. Do you really think that that'll actually happen?
Um, yes, I do think it will, but it's not going to reflect on the front lines. You won't really be able to see it easily. I think that may have been a political answer by him because there's no such thing as everyone just walks off the front line and has a break. That never happens. Usually, you have something of a rotating kind of schedule where a frontline unit will be there for a few weeks, maybe one or two, and then it gets pulled off the line for, I think, a 2 weeks rest. Sometimes that can be relegated down to an even lower amount, or maybe an even larger amount, and then another unit will take its place and then stay on the front line for a week or several. So, yes, they will eventually have a rest because these units have most likely been rotated multiple times throughout the war. So in that regard, yes, but not in the way that it kind of sounds. They're not all just going to start like having lunch and sitting down and having picnics on the front line. That's certainly not going to happen. But with that, I hope that does answer the question, and I thank you once again for the support. And once again, that's just based off of my knowledge. It may be wrong, so just going off of my general knowledge, that's the way it would be, but take it with a grain of salt, because once again, I don't have any actual military experience. All I know is from listening to other veterans and reading history books, and also reading books about the modern military and how it operates. And so with that, we have now reached the end of this question segment. If you just got back on the stream, you're probably thinking, wow, that was a quick question segment. And if you just got on the stream, you're like, wow, that question segment was really early. But once again, we're following up off the last one, and hopefully we don't have any internet connectivity issues again. Right now on my taskbar, it's showing that the rain is off and on, and I pray that it goes off, and it just says the rain is off down there, because if it continues to go on, we could run into these problems again. But with that, we're now going to be moving into the Belgorod area. That includes Kharkiv. We'll also be moving into the entirety of the Donbas. That will include Donetsk and Luhansk today. And after we cover those bits of news, we'll then be moving on to the southern front. And before we get there, we'll once again go into another question segment. So with that, it's time to get to Belgorod, where today we've seen the wonkiest missile launch that we've ever seen. I'm going to show you all this video. It's really weird. I don't really have a lot to describe what's going on or why this is happening, but just check out how this rocket launches because it's very bizarre. It's going up, it flickers a little bit, and then it starts to go into a whirlybird. It then begins to dim, and then it sits there like a star. We can now see a little bit of a twinkle coming from it. And now it's just sitting there. A lot of Russian conscripts that are in Belgorod and are being told that they're about to head back to the front lines are looking at that and thinking it's a shooting star, and they are wishing that their contract will somehow be ripped up and they'll go home. We can now see their wish coming true as a second rocket then launches and then also does the same thing as the first one. I know what this is. This is a misfire. These rockets are having some major issues. Apparently, they're most likely a form of cruise missile. Most likely a sort of Iskander. And they are having some massive issues. Both of the missiles have failed to fire and have now returned back to the Earth, largely intact, to the dismay of the Russian operators that launched them. Someone's going to wake up in the morning, they're just going to have an intact Iskander sitting in their front lawn, unexploded, but alive, and they're going to be freaking out. So, pretty interesting video. We've never seen a rocket launch quite like that. I guess you would have to accredit that to Russian excellence, both in the manufacturing of the missiles and also the launching of them, because the combination of the two led to wondrous results, and those wondrous results are is that those missiles will never make it to their target. In fact, they landed on a Russian city. So with that, we're now going to be moving out of the Belgorod area. Great video to see. And we're now going to be moving into the Kharkiv area, where all I have to say is that no action is able to be reported today because there is no action that we have on video. I once again want to say to everyone, because I know that someone's about to say that so-and-so said that something happened in the Kharkiv area, I do not take into account hearsay. I rarely take hearsay into an account, and that's usually when foreign support's involved and it's some kind of a monetary figure or a stance that a government's taken, because that kind of stuff usually isn't possible to film, and they're just statements. On the other hand, with frontline activity, I always have to have video or picture evidence to back it up, and so, as far as I'm concerned, nothing has happened in the Kharkiv area today. That may be wrong, but I do have the prerequisite of video evidence, and we don't have any as of today. So with that, we have nothing to report from the Kharkiv area, and we're now going to move down past the Zhuhiev area, where of course nothing has happened on film today, and the Balaklia area, where nothing has once again happened on video today. And we're now going to move down to the Izyum area, where something has happened today. We can see the Ukrainians using drones near the Izyum area, and apparently inflicting a little bit of hurt onto the Russians. Apparently destroying a BTR. And so, here's the video.
Так, время 5 ранку. Ми проснулись метою роз'їбать підаров. Так, нахуй.
You now see them looking at the phone, well actually the controller. Looks like they're looking through a smoky, foggy haze.
Це їхня кухня була, ті, що тут.
Да, вони там тут двіжухи ходили,
Да.
просили. Вже не будуть.
Давай в хату нахуй. Є! Є!
The artillery is landing dead on the mark.
Повтори. Пряме влучання, повторіть.
Ну, я...
А горить то як? 2 прямих по цілям.
Хорош,
Це ж не
да,
підсказували, підари
сука, гниди їбані, блядь.
Раз і вище подивись. Вище.
А все.
Наблюдай, турист, наблюдай.
Бахни.
Єсть, єсть, пряме.
Пряме влучання, повтори.
Що там, пішли стіна?
Карандашик повзнув, вже його немає в живих, мабуть.
Геть біля нього в'їбало.
Плюс, хорошо. Добрий ранку, Україна.
And we hear them talking over the radio to most likely the artillery operators. And we've now seen the scene change to an entirely different area. The drone's looking at it. The shell lands, and we hear people celebrating in the background, so it sounds like it hit on the mark.
Оце вони работають.
That's the end of the video, but it's always great to see Ukrainians having lots of fun with drones and watching the cinematic films that they're taking of Russians living their last days. And I'd have to say that they most likely were dog days. With that, we're now going to be moving out of the Izyum area. That's all we have to report for the day from there. And beyond that, there's really no action that occurs up there that we see on film, ever. Moving on past that, towards the Slovyansk area, we've not gotten any more video evidence of activity going on here. As far as we can tell, however, it does seem like the Ukrainians have been pushed onto the Zaporizhzhia River or over it, but we don't have any video evidence to back that up, and of course, I don't make any changes to the front lines or the news without video evidence, and so the front line is remaining the way it was quite some while ago. We're now going to move to the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk area, where we've gotten a couple of bits of news showing that the Ukrainians may still be withdrawing, and I'll explain why. As far as I know around here, the topography of the land is not necessarily great. We'll actually try and pull that up real quick, and we'll see. Lysychansk, no, Luhansk topographic map. Let's see if we can get a map. Oh, look at that. We have one for Google Maps, so let's pull that up real quick and take a look. So we can see here, there's Luhansk, there's Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And you can see on this map here that the ridge line is incredibly pronounced. You can see how it juts up several hundred feet from Severodonetsk. And there was also a ridge line over here on the south side of the city that I did not know about. Very interesting. But moving on past that, towards the area that the Ukrainians are at right now, you can see that they're kind of caught in a valley right here, in between Bilourivka, Zolotarivka, and then that valley kind of flattens out into the area near Verkhnyokamyanka. I'm very sorry if I butchered that, but you can see clearly that the terrain is not to their advantage. However, as you move further and further back, you can see that the valleys, instead of going north to south, they start going east to west, which is much more advantageous for defensive positions. And if we move all the way back to the area around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, you can see that it pretty much becomes nothing more than flutes of valleys that head straight into those cities and seem to be pretty decent defensive positions by and large. And so hopefully the Ukrainians are withdrawing still to make it to these defensive positions. We'll actually keep this version of the map open because it does show some very decent topography, and I'm actually pretty happy with that. And also, just to show y'all something else, the topography gets very rigid over here near the, I guess you could say, Moldova and Transnistria area, because this is getting close to the Carpathian mountain range, which is just right over here. So just letting y'all know that, we'll just in case anyone wants to touch on Transnistria in the future. But with that, we're now going to get back to the Severodonetsk area, where we have seen a video today of a Ukrainian combat medic under fire. There's not really much to add to this video, but here's the video. You see the medic laying low to the ground. We can hear the faint sounds of artillery in the background.
Ще, походу, у нас горить наша посадка. Оце гаубиця. 152 калібр. 152, блін. Або щось таке.
Как меня понял? Мне нужна резина, а не диски.
We can hear someone talking over the radio, and the medic is also identifying the caliber as most likely 152 millimeter.
От. Так що все трохи по-іншому, ніж я собі уявляла. Це стрьомно і брудно. Та оце от по нам працюють, саме по нам, по нашій посадці.
Now I'm just gonna say, the medic said that the wait, hang on, let me make sure mine flew by. I fell a little bit further. So everything is a little different than I imagined. It's scary, and it's dirty. And I could have told you that before I went to the front lines. Sadly, this realization doesn't hit some people, that war is a scary thing and also a pretty unfun thing until they get there. I hate to think that sometimes. I wish that people didn't always sit there and just go, war sucks. I wish they kind of explained how it sucks, because when you read historical context, it never really sucks because you're getting shot at. It sucks because of everything else leading up to being shot at. Usually where you sleep is incredibly uncomfortable. The food is meh. The conditions that you're always living in are very suboptimal, very poor. And then eventually, through all of that suck, you know, because in the US it's always called embracing the suck, you eventually make it to the front lines where you're then shot at, and then you go through absolute fear and chaos for a little bit, and then after that you go back to embracing the suck and living in terrible conditions. And I wish it was kind of explained like that a little bit more to people before they ever join any military around the world, because that's what war consists of, is no sleep, living in very sucky conditions, getting shot at and terrified, and then repeating that cycle over and over and over until the war ends. So with that, we're going to let the video continue.
Стрьомно і брудно. Та оце от по нам працюють, саме по нам, по нашій посадці. Якось так.
But hopefully the medic stays okay. It seems like they were pretty decently well in this video. We can see that there is in something of a foxhole. It looks to be a pretty big one, but hopefully they will be all right. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next clip of news. But before we do, all right, thank you. I was about to get that one. But with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, where we can actually see the distance that Russian helicopters operate at. So we're actually going to open up a brand new Google Maps. Sorry about that. We now have 3 of them up, pretty much. But we're going to go to a new Google Maps, and we're going to find the oil refinery, because based off of this oil refinery, now we saw Russian helicopters firing over today, which appears that it may be right here. And if I'm correct, we're going to get a pretty good idea of how close helicopters have to get to the front lines to fire off the unguided rockets. So going off of this as a basis, we're now going to go to this map. And so the oil refinery is here. And as far as we know, the front lines are somewhere around here. And so let's get out a ruler and measure. Looks like the maximum firing range of a helicopter using unguided rockets from the Russian side is around 3 miles to 5 miles, most likely. And so that's giving us a very good perspective of how far a Russian helicopter has to be from the front lines to fire off the unguided rockets. So now we have a basis. If we ever see them firing at something, they have to be within 3 to 5 miles of the target. And so with that, here's a video of Russian helicopters firing unguided rockets over the Lysychansk oil refinery that we were just looking at. We've seen them, of course, tilting up and firing. And now that we know this information of how far they actually are from the front lines, and we actually have kind of a set number to go off of, this gives us a pretty good idea of what kind of anti-air you would need. They're too far away to be visually spotted most of the time by manpad groups. But at the same time, I'm not sure if a radar would be able to pick them up fairly easily. And that's of course why they're using these treetop tactics. It's almost impossible to shoot them down at this rate. Now flying off, we can get a pretty good look at one of them. It's a Ka-52, pretty standard helicopter for the Russians. And of course, everyone's trying to take a photo op. Sadly, we couldn't see the second helicopter. It didn't look like a Ka-52. It looks like an Mi-24 or an Mi-35. But with that, that's the end of the video. And the most important thing that we got out of it is the idea of how far away Russian helicopters are when they're firing off the rockets. With that, we're now going to be moving a little bit further behind the lines, or we've seen a brand new form of armored personnel carrier, one that's scarier than the Terminator. And I don't think it's scary for the Ukrainians. I think it's scary for the Russians. If y'all are from the United States, or maybe some European countries, y'all will usually remember the cattle trailers that trucks carry. And just for those of y'all who are not from the United States, I'm going to show y'all a semi-truck cattle trailer. This is what it looks like. And it's not just a cattle trailer. It can carry chickens and other kinds of livestock. But this is what you put livestock into when moving them around. It appears that the Russians never really got the message across clear enough to their citizens that they really view their people as animals. Now they're trying to get the message across a little bit better, as they're now using a livestock trailer to move soldiers to the front line, as you can see here. Now, if this doesn't send the message to the Russian citizenry that they really don't care, I don't know what will, because they've marked the thing with a Z, clear as all day, spray painted the thing green, and it has an open top in it, and these guys are riding in the back like some kind of animals. So, not really a good image. The Russians are never good with the imagery, beyond the videos that they try and fake, but it's a pretty funny sight to say the least. So with that, we're now going to be moving away from this picture. We're going to sit here for a couple of seconds and let this soak in. Now that I've given a couple of seconds for y'all to soak this in, we're now going to be moving on to the next bit of news. And I just saw someone call them war pigs, which is actually a really good idea to call them. And with that, we're now going to be moving out of the Lysychansk area as well as behind the lines, and we're now going to be moving down to the Papasana area, where we've seen a pretty solid mortar hit from the Ukrainians. Of course, this was shot at a Russian IFV, and we can hear some pretty epic music. You could see the mortar firing right over there in the right side of the film. It does appear to be a small infantry mortar, and we can see the BMP-2 right there. The mortar then hits with a little animation added on, and it's just off from the BMP. The second shot, however, is not off. As they say in Ukraine, second time is the charm. And it looks like they hit that BMP dead on. Once again, great to see. And hopefully, we see more footage like that, especially with the smaller mortars that we never really see a lot of action from. With that, we have now covered all of the news in the Luhansk area, which was a pretty small amount of news today, and we're now going to move down into the Donetsk area, where we've got some more interesting news. Starting off, we've seen a Ukrainian helicopter, once again firing at the Russians. In the usual fashion, much like every helicopter, the helicopter tilted up. It appears to be an Mi-24. It fired off its rockets, which we sadly did not hear on film, but you can see the plume of the rocket's path. And the helicopter is now taking a sharp left turn and keeping low to the tree line. With that, that's the end of the video, and it's pretty interesting to see that the Ukrainians are still using their helicopters, and also the Mi-24s, which seem to be extraordinarily rare. With that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, which, sadly, is some unfortunate news. Every city that's ever gotten close to the front lines has, of course, suffered from Russian attacks and the civilian deaths that ensue. And the city of Toretsk, which has been incredibly close to the front lines for some while, has finally fallen victim to a missile attack, as a missile strike landed in Toretsk, and as far as we know, 3 people are under the rubble. Whether they're dead or alive, we're not entirely sure at the moment, but we can assume that by the damage we see here in this video, some of them are certainly dead. I hope that the Russians make sure, well, I hope that the Ukrainians make sure that the Russians pay for what they've done to these Ukrainians and all of the other tens of thousands of Ukrainians that they've killed over the course of this war. We don't know the number of Ukrainian soldiers that has died, but we do know the number of civilians that's died, and it's somewhere above the 50,000 mark at this moment, and it continues to rise every single day. And those 50,000 people got killed for no reason rather than Russian incompetence or deliberate attacks where they're trying to kill off the civilian population. It's either one or the other, and it's sickening to think that they've been able to get away with this far, and I think it's a good reason for the United States to ramp up the rate at which they're sending supplies over along with the rest of the world, and also so that way we can make sure that the Russians are never able to pull off this kind of stuff again, and that they'll have less time to do it, as hopefully the Ukrainians would be able to push the Russians out of the country if we only gave them more firepower. With that, we're now going to be moving down to our last bit of news from the Luhansk and Donetsk area, where we saw today a Russian tank get destroyed on film. Kind of a massive explosion, to be honest, and especially when the video started. And we can also see a turret come falling out of the cloud. Right there, as a matter of fact. That's the turret. Looks like it was going for a turret toss competition. We're not really sure how high it went, though, because it was actually shrouded almost entirely in that plume of smoke. But it's great to see that the Ukrainians are still knocking out tanks, and I hope that the Russians, if they ever get back into the Olympics, will have created a brand new sport of turret tossing. With that, that is all the news we have from the Donetsk area. We don't know of any, I guess you could call them advances that are happening on either side. It does appear that by and large the front has fallen into a stalemate, with neither side managing to make any ground anymore. And if we look at this topographical map, which I just pulled up, you can see that both sides should be evenly pitched against each other, because the ground in between the Russian front lines and the Ukrainian front lines through this area is relatively flat, actually. It's incredibly flat for Ukrainian terms. And what's really cool is that you can actually see the mounds that were created from the slag heaps that still exist to this day in some areas of Donetsk. And you can find these around the world. Just as a quick little aside, you can actually find one in Germany. Well, actually, you can find a lot of stuff in Germany. You can find this massive pit here, where they mine out some of the dirtiest coal in the world. You can also find this massive hill of all of the, I guess you could call it slag, and just raw rocks and debris that they've dug out of the ground trying to mine coal. So kind of an interesting thing. The Rhine is filled with this stuff, and in fact, there's been so much mining of coal in the Rhine River Valley area that the ground there has actually sank a couple of feet, and it sank so low that the Germans have to constantly keep water pumps pumping the water out of the surrounding land. Otherwise, if those pumps stop working, practically the entire Rhine River Valley area will become a large lake, or like the Sea of Kiev. So an interesting story there. I thought I would share that one with y'all because one always does have to remember that these kinds of slag heaps here are actually very formidable defensive positions if you can get soldiers on top of them. If y'all may remember, the battle at the Azovstal steel plant, there is actually a big slag heap right here, and both sides fought over that for a pretty good while, about a couple of weeks before the Ukrainians eventually lost it and were pushed off of it and into the mill itself. So, I hope y'all found that little tidbit of information interesting as to the situation in the Donetsk area. But as far as I know, getting back to the slag heaps and everything, no one's really using the slag heaps. It seems like the front lines kind of zigzag in between them and around them if we look at a map. And so with that is the end of the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv segment news, and we're now going to start moving on into the southern front, which will include the Zaporizhzhia front line, the Kherson area, and the Kherson finger. But before we get there, we're of course going to answer 3 questions from the chat, and after we answer those 3 questions, we'll then be moving on to our last segment of news. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, and it is now time for round 2 of the question segment, and up first we have a $42 super chat from Cliff Mitchell, who says, I know you're biased, but that's okay, because you know it and you declare it, so we can take it into account. Great channel, Slava Ukraine, and Hiram Slava.
Well, thank you very much for the support, Cliff. But I do have to say that while I am biased and I do pick a pro-Ukrainian side, I'm never really biased in my assessment of the battlefield situation, and that's something I always want to make clear, because, just because I'm pro-Ukrainian doesn't mean that my emotions guide my beliefs in what's happening on the front line, because I just look at it and say things are going good, things are going bad. So far, honestly, in the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk area, things are not going to Ukraine's advantage necessarily. It's been one of the few times in the war things have not been going to Ukraine's advantage, and hopefully that can turn around soon. And I'm sure that the boss will give me absolutely no credit for saying that, and they'll say I'm some kind of a shill or a CIA operative or something, but I do usually look at the situation just by and large in an unbiased perspective, although I am pro-Ukrainian. So with that, I thank you once again for the support, and that does help us continue to run this channel, and also, Slava Ukraini. And with that, we are on to the next question, and thank you once again for the support.
And up next, we have a $20 super chat from Anthony, who does not leave a comment. But Anthony, thank you very much for your support of the channel. We appreciate you very much, and thank you for watching for so long. I know you've been around for quite some time, so thank you very much for that. And up next, we have a $20 super chat from Kaltenberg, who says, VPN.
And I thank you very much for the support, Coldenberg. I actually covered that one before we even got to the question segment, but we do have a VPN. I'm not going to say which one, but it does work fairly well, and it was actually a considerably good cost. One thing I will tell y'all that's pretty interesting, and I don't know if this is going to hurt us from getting a VPN sponsor in the future for our normal videos, but
Unfortunately, I personally wouldn't go into that.
Well, what do you think I'm about to go into?
It depends, but I would probably stay away from that topic for the time being.
Well, I don't think this one's going to hurt much to say, but I'm going to just say this and we'll move on. All of them use the same encryption codes. So with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and I thank you once again for the support, Kaltenberg.
All right, yes, and thank you very much for that support. And up next, we have a $20 super chat from Brian Springborn, who says, when does it matter let's see here. So he meant to say, when does it become a matter of another country sending soldiers to help crush Russia?
It would become that matter if it was a chemical, biological, or nuclear attack. I feel like I repeat that one a lot, but that's the only way the United States would step in. And the British, or really no one around the world, has made that kind of statement with Ukraine, drawing a red line rather than the United States. The British drew a red line with the Finns, which aren't even in a war right now, but it's a decent defensive pact to have with them, also while they're in the process of joining NATO, which they should be in pretty soon. But I think that would be the only prerequisite, and the thing is with that is that if the United States joins, NATO is not going to join with them. That's one thing to keep in mind. The United States, of course, would use NATO as a basing point to move forces and supplies into Ukraine. But beyond that, NATO is a completely defensive alliance, and so Article 5 would not be invoked in that kind of instance. So the U.S. would be on their own, but that doesn't really matter because everyone knows that the United States is the military superpower of the world. It has a budget that dwarfs every other country in the next 8 positions in terms of the amount of funding they put into their military. And really, the United States could just wipe the floor with the Russians if they ever need it to. So In that regard, if the United States had to step in, it would be chemical, biological, or nuclear. And just honestly stating the facts, not being biased or anything as an American, we do know that the United States would just wipe the floor. We already see American technology wiping the floor with the Russians right now. And if we actually went over there with the American military, which uses solely that kind of equipment, it wouldn't go well for the Russians. And so with that, I hope that does answer the question, and I thank you once again for the support. So with that, we have now reached the end of this question segment. We're now going to move on to the Southern Front and also the rest of the news from around the country and the speech from President Zelensky. And after that, we're going to answer all of the super chats we've gotten tonight and also all the ones that come in after that point, and also as many live chat questions as possible. So with that, we're now moving down into the Zaporizhzhia front line, where near the city of Polochi today, we finally saw it. We finally saw a T-62M be destroyed by a drone bomblet. And it had already been abandoned prior to the video. And God, this tank is derelict. It's awful looking. As it zooms out, you'll see how bad it is. But just take a look at this video. And of course, let me mute that. The bomblet drops, it falls. It was a perfect shot. It hits the rim of the hatch. If I could slow this video down, I wish I could. But it hits the rim of the hatch, and then it goes and bounces straight into the turret basket. Just perfect. A perfect shot. When you see that the hatches on top of the tank are closed, but the driver's hatch is open, which does show us that apparently they have bailed out of the tank. And when you see it's clearly marked with Z's, and also clearly marked with a large amount of rust. The grenade then explodes, popping open all the hatches in the tank, and letting us see that it definitely was abandoned before the drone even dropped the bomblet in there. But golly, what is this? This is filth. This is just disgusting. This whole entire thing is covered in rust. It hardly even has a layer of primer on it anymore. And the Russians pushed this into frontline service. That is the most embarrassing and disgraceful thing that the Russians could ever do, is to show how bad off their military is that they're pulling out things that were in a far Siberian supply yard rotting away for the past 30 years and putting them on the front lines to fight. This is worse condition equipment than the Iraqis fought the United States with during the Gulf War, and look how well that turned out for them. And now that you can see the Russians using them here in Ukraine, it's like, I find it more important moving off of the drone and talking about the quality of this tank, because if the Russians are having to start to pull out this kind of stuff, imagine how many systems were not working in that tank before it was even destroyed. I'm sure that the gun stabilizer was not working. I'm sure that the night vision devices were not working. I'm sure that everything in that tank was probably not working based off of what we can see externally from what this tank looks like. But golly, that's rough. It's good to see that they're finally using them, because of course we know that they've been brought down to that level where they're running out of supplies that badly, but at the same time, I've never seen a tank in that bad of a condition actually being used on a front line ever. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on from that bit of news, which was an absolute shock and a nightmare to watch, and we're now going to be moving on to the next bit of news, where we've seen the 45th Brigade destroy some Russian vehicles. The 45th Brigade has had a pretty decent habit of destroying Russian vehicles, and this video is of course no exception. When you see the Russian vehicles amongst the trees, you can also see a decent amount of civilian vehicles littered around with Z's marked onto them, a couple of BMPs, and now the Ukrainian artillery is firing. The artillery shells are landing dead on, and we can see the destruction of the vehicles that we just saw in the last clip. Some of them aren't even recognizable. For example, this Ural 4320 that used to be right here, but you can't even tell that it was here because the chassis doesn't even exist anymore. You can also see the same Lada that was in the film earlier. Destroyed BMP-2, destroyed BMP-2 again, another BTR that was destroyed. Pretty much everything in that tree line turned into dust, and it's great to see so, because the 45th Artillery Brigade has pretty much been holding the front lines on its own without a large amount of infantry support, and they still continue to do so, and they're constantly incurring a decent stream of Russian casualties and losses as the war continues, and the Russians haven't even been pushing an offensive here for about 2 months. So once again, great to see. Of course, we don't know of any offensive or defensive actions that are occurring in the Zaporizhzhia area, but by and large, things are looking up for the Ukrainians there, as they're still inflicting losses on the Russians, and the Russians, of course, are now using T-62Ms because they've run out of other things to use. With that, we're now going to be moving on to the area of the Kherson Finger, where today we've seen one bit of news, which is the Russians being hit by a drone bomblet. It's a little bit of an unfortunate video, but the Ukrainians do get them pretty good. So here's the video. You can see the bomblet being dropped. And then hits straight onto the Russians. And we see one guy here who appears to be slightly crippled. We don't see any blood, but based off of how his leg's moving, we can assume that he's apparently had some kind of a partial paralysis, perhaps. Pretty interesting video to see, and it is good to see that the Ukrainians are still inflicting casualties on the Russians, and sometimes wounding a soldier is better than killing them directly, because then that wounded soldier is going to eat up supplies and additional manpower to have to try and take care of them until they can be taken off the lines. So we'll of course be looking at the Kherson Finger and the Kherson area in general to see if any more Ukrainian advances have been made, but as far as it's gone today, while we have a large amount of activity, no advances have been made. Moving on to probably the best bit of news we got from the Kherson area of the front lines, we did see a Russian win the Darwin Award today, which is pretty neat. Every time someone wins the Darwin Award, they're once again clearing out the gene pool around the world and making room for the better and brighter people that could be taking their place. When you see an example of someone here who's lacking a massive amount of brain cells, as this guy shoots straight into the silo of an S-300 missile and blows it up along with the other 4 missiles that are probably on this truck, and pretty much engulfs himself into a fireball. And so here's the video.
Готов? Готов. Огонь.
Oh man, I don't think they expected that, but I don't know what idiot would shoot a missile and not expect it to blow up on the ground. And so let's watch that again. You can tell the guy on the ground that shot the machine gun was not expecting that, because his head hit the ground. He didn't know what to do. He just paused in fear. So let's watch that one more time. You can see him right there. He drops the machine gun, and he's so scared. He's slamming his head to the ground as fast as he can. You can tell it from the quick second we see him right here in that frame. But oh my gosh. And then the second guy who's actually filming, it looks like he's going to turn around and try and run away. But it looks like the fireball's already caught up to him. Also, to answer why they were destroying a Ukrainian S-300, as far as we're able to tell, and this could be wrong, this is somewhat earlier war footage that finally made it out now. And so, of course, it's included in day 133. But some people have said this may have been as early in the war as the first weeks when they overran the Ukrainian units initially that were taken by surprise. We're not really sure about that. But this guy here, we got to watch this one last time. I'm sorry, I know this is the 4th time, but the 4th time is the charm. I got to watch this guy slam his head into the ground again. It's so fast. He literally went light speed on breaking his nose onto the hard dirt ground. And so wonderful to see again. And with that, we're not going to watch that one more time because I'll be stuck watching that all night in a loop. But with that, we're now going to move on to the news from inside of Kherson City itself, where we've seen a little bit of tomfoolery occurring with some Ukrainian, I guess you could say, partisans or saboteurs. They've gotten some Russian fatigues, it seems. I don't know if it's soaked in blood or not, but we can see them painting Z's onto it, and also whining out the area of the sign, I guess that said Kherson in Russian, and then putting a message on it.
Ми стараємось. Ідемо вам на поміч. Херсон! Слава Україні! Слава Україні!
So pretty great to see. And if that's blood-soaked, I wonder where they got that from. So with that, we're now going to be moving on to the next bit of location, well, Kherson news, where we can then see inside the city, the Ukrainians apparently hit a precision strike and destroyed a depot within the city. Or this may have been a saboteur attack. I'm not really sure which. But the depot is burning. So regardless of what destroyed it, it is definitely burning, as you can see in this video. Wonderful to see that another depot was caught on fire. This one seems to be a smaller one, but it is within the city. And so it appears that the Russian garrison that's at Kherson will not be having an ideal time trying to find ammunition, or as easy a time. Excuse me, everyone actually got a small amount of coffee tonight. But with that, we're now going to be moving on to the last bit of news we've gotten from the Kherson area, where we can see the Russians firing at Ukrainian positions near Kherson. I wanted to include this video because it was one of the few videos that was located near the Kherson region, and it showed a firefight. But this is of course not showing that the Russians are gaining any kind of ground or hand. It's just showing the Russian perspective of the exact same front line we've been seeing for the past few weeks. SPG-9 was just fired right there towards a supposed Ukrainian position, although we can't see it on film. It looks like they're not actually firing the SPG-9, it looks like they're firing
Корнет вообще
Hornets.
очень универсальный птур, очень мобильный. Переносится на треноги и...
What's a little stupid to me is that they put the SPG-9 and the Cornet right under one single tree. Look, wait a minute, hang on. No way. Oh my god. They put both of them under the tree to get some shade while they're using them. That is lame. I'll tell y'all this. I went reenacting on the 4th of July, and there was not a single bit of shade out there the entire day, and I was wearing solid wool, and I felt like I nearly died of a heat stroke. And these goofballs in the actual military are going to put two anti-tank weapons, an SPG-9 and a Cornets, under the exact same tree for the shade. Now, this is the stupidest thing I've seen so far. And I gotta say, these guys are wimps. Because if they're wearing cotton, which is most likely what they're wearing, and then they're going to put them under a tree, that's just wimpy.
Корнет вообще очень универсальный птур, очень мобильный. Переносится на треноги и... Переносится на треноги, стреляет на расстояние примерно до 5 километров. Может попадать в цель. Управляется лазерным лучом. При этом очень быстро сворачивается. Вот. Есть
And
попадание.
some people are saying that this is going to hide it from drone view, but the drones don't look straight down. You know, usually they look kind of towards the horizon, and so it's not really hiding them from drone view either, because most of the videos we've seen are of drones spotting Russian vehicles hidden amongst tree lines and Russian infantry walking amongst them as well. And so this is doing nothing to hide them. I think the entire purpose that they've set both of these under the tree for is for shade. And on top of that, if it was to try and hide them from the drones, there is another tree off screen to the left here that we saw a little bit earlier on, and they should have taken the SPG-9 and moved it over to the other tree, so that way if a tank or an artillery shell lands somewhere around there, it's not going to take both the Cornets and the SPG-9 out in a single shot. And while I do kind of sound like an armchair general here, I'm going to have to stick to my guns, because they literally put both of them under the same tree because, one, they're lazy and they can use the SPG-9 and the Cornets without having to walk really far, and it's also a shady spot, and the Ukrainian summer, as far as we've been told, has been getting kind of hot.
Таня. Вот в той большой башне был наблюдательный пункт противника. Сейчас надо срочно отсюда очень быстро уходить. Вот чем очень удобен Корнет, он очень быстро сворачивается. Сейчас группа из 3-4 человек его сворачивает и сразу же покидает огневую позицию. И мы тоже, потому что может пойти ответный огонь.
На черный?
They're now packing up and moving it.
Тут же добьем, тут же опорник, только с другой позиции. Попробуем сейчас, ну как варик, по тому или чуть левее. Вот так. Там у них основной, где вот опорник, и сверху в напорной башне. Мы их подожгли, и сейчас левее дадим. Там у них скопление людей и техники. Ну уже, видишь, пристрелялись. Основной подожгли мы, и сейчас так, по нюансам бьем.
Alright, now, you notice here, because I see some people saying that, you know, I don't know why, but some people are saying that something I said didn't make any sense, or it'd be smart for them to use shade. Here's an example of them in the same video not using shade and also setting up the coordinates in the wide open. So, not necessarily using the tree for cover from drones, because here's an example of them not doing that. And so they literally set them both up just to take advantage of the shade of the tree. And the reason why I'm saying that that's kind of goofy and silly is that they're trying to make the Russian military look like they're tough as nails and they're knocking out Ukrainians and they just don't give a crap about anything. And if that was true, then why did they set up both weapons within walking distance of each other and also within the shade of a tree? I mean, like, that just kind of looks weak to me, and especially considering that I can wear all wool and go out and just hang out all day long and nearly die of a heat stroke. I would think that they would be able to do something similar, wearing all cotton and also using trucks to move around their stuff.
Есть. Давай по опорнику, который под водонапоркой.
Правый, да?
До конца провожай.
And you notice how they didn't even move? I mean, like, they're literally looking at the same place they were firing at earlier. They literally just moved to the tree I was talking about on the left side of the camera earlier and then set it up there. And so they're literally just doing this as a fake, pretty much.
Good. Есть.
Наша ракета долетела до опорного пункта. Дважды сменили позицию для того, чтобы не получить обратно ответный огонь. Сейчас очень быстро уходим отсюда.
And they're now moving out of the way. So, pretty fake video. We didn't even see any return fire. Usually, there would most likely be return fire. Kind of a lame video. So, with that, that's the only combat footage, supposed combat footage we got from the Kherson area today. But it is painting a picture of Russian incompetence once more, although they're trying to show the Russians as pretty brave and pretty fearless. With that, we're now going to be moving out of the Kherson area, and we're now going to be moving to Lviv, where we've actually seen some Ukrainian units training. Apparently new ones that will be heading to the front soon. Sadly, it was removed. I hate to see that. It didn't really give away, like this post says here. It didn't really give away any Ukrainian positions or anything. It was just showing some Ukrainians holding wooden guns and being taught how to use them and shoot them. But sadly, that video was taken down. So with that, we've actually covered all of the news for the day. And we're now going to circle back to Kyiv to wrap out the end of Week 18. And tomorrow will actually be the beginning of Week 19 of the war. And so, here's the speech from the man, the myth, the legend, President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let me get that back on full screen again, trying to change the graphics.
Українці, українки, усі наші захисники і захисниці. Сьогодні в Харкові російським ракетним ударом був зруйнований педагогічний університет, головний корпус, лекторії, університетський музей, наукова бібліотека. Це з точністю до 100% характеризує російське вторгнення. Якщо давати визначення тому, що таке варварство, цей удар підходить найбільше. Тільки ворог цивілізованості і людяності може робити такі речі, бити ракетами по університету, по педагогічному університету. Пошкоджено цим ударом і вже другий об'єкт, який присвячений Григорію Сковороді, пам'ятник, що був на площі перед університетом. Його завалило уламками, але все ж таки пам'ятник не розбитий. А от музей Сковороди, розташований на Харківщині, ще в травні згорів після російського обстрілу. Втім, перефразовуючи найвідоміші слова Сковороди, як би окупанти не намагалися нас зловити, їм нас не спіймати. Ми обов'язково вистоїмо і все відновимо. Нарешті відчувається, що дуже потужно запрацювала західна артилерія. Та зброя, яку ми отримали від наших партнерів, її точність дійсно така, як потрібно. Наші оборонці завдають дуже відчутних ударів по складах та інших точках, які важливі для логістики окупантів. І це суттєво знижує наступальний потенціал російської армії. Втрати окупантів з кожним тижнем будуть тільки зростати, як і ускладненість їхнього постачання. Сьогодні широкому загалу стало відомо, що на півдні нашої країни в окупованих районах був закритий доступ до соціальних мереж, месенджерів і Ютубу. Російські сили заблокували будь-яку можливість людей знати правду про те, що відбувається, і про наш потенціал, який ми поступово збільшуємо. Українські сили просуваються наразі на кількох тактичних напрямках, зокрема і на півдні, на Херсонщині, в Запорізькій області. Ми не віддамо нашу землю, вся суверенна територія України буде українською. Люди мають про це знати. Тому, якщо у вас є можливість говорити з людьми на півдні нашої держави, з Херсоном, Геніческом, Бердянськом, Мелітополем та іншими містами і селами, поширюйте, будь ласка, там правду. Використовуйте будь-яку можливість, щоб сказати людям в окупованих районах, що ми про них пам'ятаємо і за них ми боремось. Боремось за увесь наш південь, за увесь український Донбас. Там зараз найбільш жорстоке протистояння біля Слов'янську і Бахмуту. Боремось за Харківщину. І хай окупанти не думають, ніби їхній час на цій землі довгий, а перевага їхньої артилерії вічна. Провів засідання Ставки Верховного Головнокомандувача. Як завжди, заслухав доповіді і від військових, і від розвідки. Спільно визначили напрямки дій на найближчий час. Розширюємо зовнішньополітичні напрямки для нашої держави. Вперше в історії українсько-парагвайських відносин провів розмову з президентом Парагваю. І ми цінуємо підтримку від цієї країни і будемо і надалі посилювати зв'язки в Латинській Америці. Також сьогодні говорив з президентом Мозамбіку, привітав з обранням його держави до Ради безпеки ООН і вважає, що Африка має отримати більше представництва на міжнародних майданчиках і при вирішенні глобальних питань. Саме африканським країнам зараз чи не найбільше загрожує продовольча криза, яку спровокувала Росія. І маємо зробити все, щоб змусити державу-терориста розблокувати український аграрний експорт. Відбувся візит до Києва прем'єр-міністра Ірландії, держави, яка нам суттєво допомагає. Ірландія навіть допомагала нам переконувати представників держав-скептиків у Євросоюзі, що Україна заслуговує на кандидатство і подальше членство в ЄС. Окрім цього, пам'ятаємо, що Сенат Ірландії визнав злочини російських окупантів геноцидом українського народу. І цей крок, а також підтримка Ірландією юридичних зусиль для покарання російських воєнних злочинів – це все дуже важливо. Разом з роботою українських правоохоронців, допомога партнерів – це саме ті цеглинки, з яких і буде побудовано відновлення справедливості для України. Кожен російський вбивця, кат і гвалтівник, які прийшли на нашу землю, будуть відповідати, і неважливо, скільки часу займе виконання цього завдання. Ні для кого з окупантів не буде спокою. Я вдячний всім, хто бореться за Україну. Слава Україні!
And with that, that is the end of the speech from President Zelensky here on day 133 of the news. And that wraps out the 18th week of the war, and we'll now be entering the 19th week of the war tomorrow. If you were here for the news segment alone and somehow managed to get through the first stream, the internet outage, and then on to this one, thank you so much for watching. And if you would like to subscribe, I would be highly appreciative. And we also run these streams every single day of the week at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, except for Mondays. We also upload daily summaries showing highlights of the war, and we also plan on uploading videos in the future that will be pertaining to information and such things off the war. I actually ran into some interesting topics today I'm kind of debating as making videos of them or not, like the Corporation of London, which a lot of people probably don't know about. But with that, thank you all for watching once again, and we're now going to move into our question segment, where we're going to answer everyone's questions that we possibly can. Of course, all of the super chats, because we always want to recognize everyone who's helped to keep this channel running. And then we'll answer as many live chats as we can. And so with that, we're on to the question segment. So what do we got, Matthew?
All right, and we are now into our final question segment of the night. And before we get to our super chats and live chat questions, I want to go over the poll that I put up about 18 minutes ago. We had a question come in from Archangel, one of the viewers, and I turned it into a poll because it was a really good question. So the question was, what do you think Putin would do if U.S. forces were sent into Ukraine? Option 1 was a nuclear strike, 2 was surrender, 3 was declare war on NATO, and 4 was no response from Putin. It looks like 48% of you believe that he would declare war on NATO, and 25% of you believe he would order a nuclear strike. So pretty interesting results there, and that was a very good question by Archangel, by the way. And Enforcer, would you like to weigh in on that poll at all?
I'd have to say that is actually a really good poll. One thing I would say, though, is that declaring war on NATO seems to be the best option, but if it was an action by the United States alone, NATO would not be dragged in for Russia to have to declare war against all of NATO. It would depend on the political situation, of course, because if NATO did align with the United States and did decide to just pretty much step forward each country independently and then individually declare war, that would be one thing. But considering that it wouldn't be invoking Article 5 if the United States went into Ukraine and then went to war with Russia, NATO wouldn't be directly involved, and they wouldn't be directly pulled in. But that is about the most logical answer I could come up with if the United States was to get involved, is that it would most likely just lead to all-out war with all of the Western countries, be it one way or another. Also, I think it is interesting that a lot of people said that he would just immediately order a nuclear strike. I do see where everyone's coming from with that, but it would be weird to me. It's like, sir, the Americans have arrived, and then Putin just opens up the nuclear football and just starts mashing the buttons, turning the keys, inputting the codes, and all that kind of stuff. But I could see that happening, because at that point, the Russians would be on a downward spiral from then on, and there would really be no way back up. So with that, actually pretty interesting poll. I do have to agree with the results. And so with that, we are now going to move on to our questions. And so with that, what do we got?
All right, so first up, yeehaw! We have a $50 super chat from Alice Houston, who says, Slava Ukraine.
And Slava Ukraini. And I thank you so much once again for the support. It does help out our channel a lot. And I thank you once again for helping us to keep on going forward, because if it wasn't for the support from our viewers, we just wouldn't be able to keep the channel running. And so with that, thank you once again. And also, let me do a better Zelensky impression. Slava Ukraini. And with that, we're on to the next one.
And up next, we have a $20 super chat from Santiago Flores, who says, comment for the Enforcer and Enforcer Matt, NATO is at war with Russia right now. The only difference that the Ukrainians are using NATO ex-Warsaw Pact weapons.
That's somewhat true, I would say. We are in an economic war with the Russians. We're also in a supply war with the Russians, I guess you could say, and trying to make sure that Ukraine stays alive through Western arms imports. So in that regard, I guess you could make the kind of abstract idea that they are at war, but, you know, under the technical terms of a war, we're not. We're not directly combating them, but I do see where you're coming from. And also, Ukraine is using a very interesting mix of ex-Warsaw Pact weapons as well as Western weapons. And I think that's the weirdest thing we've ever seen so far. And it is a testament to the Ukrainians' mental agility to be able to go from using entirely Eastern weapons 8 years ago to now they're using a blend of both Western and Eastern weapons. And so a very interesting thing to actually look at there and kind of talk about. And with that, I thank you once again for support. I hope that does address the comment, and we are on to the next one.
And next up, we have a $20 super chat from Tangan Bragiri, who says, hit that like button, everyone. And it looks like everybody definitely has. We are up to 1.9 thousand likes. So thank you to everybody for hitting that like button.
And also, I thank you all once again for hitting that like button, and I hope that y'all all do hit the like button. Tangan Brigiri every once in a while comes through and tries to rally the troops, and I hope that the Lee Spring Army pulls through and we can just pass 2,000 likes here in just a second. I'm going to look at the screen and see if we do within the next 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. We just did it. All right, that's pretty cool. So I thank you all very much once again for hitting that like button. And also, thank you so much, Tangan Brigiri, for the support, and also encouraging everyone to hit the like button, too, because if y'all don't know, that helps us to reach more people, and that helps more people to get this news. And so if you like the news and wish to have found it sooner, hitting the like button will help other people to find the news sooner. So with that, thank you once again for the support, Tangan, and we're on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $17 super chat from Olivia McCarthy, who says, it looks like Belarus is talking about Ukrainian provocation and denazification of Ukraine. I think Belarus is going to try and invade Ukraine with their Russian allies.
That's something that could happen. But one thing that always has to be considered is that the Belarusians have become a supply arm of the Russians, and they're trying to supply the Russians with tanks and equipment to keep them going, which kind of gives you an idea of how desperate the Russians are for materials. The second thing is that Belarus has been saying this kind of stuff ever since the beginning of the war, and people's memories, and it's always something that everyone always has to combat. This is something that everyone does, but everyone's memories are usually short term when it comes to current events, and we forget what things were like months ago. Because months ago, if y'all may remember, Lukashenko was actually pulling out maps and showing the Russian battle plans and talking about how they were going to join in and help them out. And that was a massive fear within the first month of the war, is that the Belarusians were going to join in as well and create this never-ending front line across the entirety of the north of Ukraine. But that never happened. And while they're kind of ramping up that talk again recently, I just don't think it's going to happen. There's too many cogs in the Belarusian machine that are turning in the wrong direction for a war to be able to happen. We know that the entire military is not really behind it. We've heard that there's been mutinies and refusals to go into the war. We've also seen Lukashenko kind of on the fence sometimes. And while he'll say very fiery rhetoric, he usually reverses it within weeks and goes to trying to make it sound like Belarus is being bullied by the Russians. So, of course, we'll have to wait and see, but I can agree with you that that talk has been ramping up recently, and I could be wrong. The Belarusians may be preparing for war, but at the same time, they might not be. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, but I do thank you very much for the support and for sharing your opinion, because it is an interesting one, and maybe people in the chat will also like to talk about it as well. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next one, but thank you once again. And with that, we are on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $10 super chat from one of our channel decoders, WF2U, along with Mark Hodges, who figured out the Morse code. They said, Enforcer and Enforcer Matt, the Morse code message is, if Ukraine can hold until the fall, they will be in a better position. FYI, plain language Morse code is not deciphered, it's just like a dictation.
Also, I thank you very much for the support, and I have heard that before. It's just that I think, I mean, like, cipher sounds cool, so I guess I just kind of use that by default because it sounds like the cooler thing to say. But I do thank you very much for the support, and also, ding, 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 you did get it correct. So congratulations on that, and I do believe that that does stand true. If the Ukrainians can hold until the fall, the Rasputitsa will come back into season. They'll have most of their supplies and arms that are supposed to be sent over by the West at that point, and they'll be in a very good position to start counterattacks across most of the front lines and actually make some sizable ground and also inflict massive losses. So congratulations on cracking the Morse code. I don't know what to call it now. I don't want to call it standard vocation because that kind of sounds a little boring. But congratulations once again on getting it, because you are correct. That is what the Morse code says. And so I'll have to try and come up with a new one over the span of the next few days. But with that, I thank you once again for the support and cracking the Morse. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next question. And thank you once again for the support.
All right, and up next we have a $10 super chat from Scott Haskins, who says, Enforcer, what do you think about a Ukraine Greatest Hits video compilation? Maybe along with Starsky's Metal Music. My favorite so far is the Russian tank that double-tapped itself on the mines, LOL.
Well, thank you very much for the support, but sadly, I don't think we would have enough time to do something like that. For example, today, the internet in my house went off because someone went by, and just for y'all to know, our internet is actually connected to a light switch in our house, which is a very confusing thing, but someone went by and clicked the light switch and turned off my internet for a good 10 to 15 minutes in the middle of me trying to put together the stream, and so I was actually almost hard-pressed to actually make the stream happen tonight at all, so that kind of gives you a perspective of the timetables I'm working on, and that's working almost 9 hours a day on this stuff, making summaries and streams. And so I would like to do something like that, but I just am going to be honest and say we're very hard pressed on this channel for time, just doing the things we're doing now. And we're also trying to expand out into videos beyond the war, and that's going to be a very massive challenge to try and conquer as well. And so sadly, I don't think we'd be able to do that, but it is a really cool idea. And I hope someone out there does take up the reins and eventually makes, those a video like that, because I would love to see it. And I'd honestly like to see the Russian guy busting out his teeth on top of the BMP again when the bomblets were falling and he was freaking out. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and I thank you so much for the support, but I hope you can understand that we're just really hard-pressed for time here, and it's really hard to get around to other projects in general. So with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and thank you once again for the support.
All right, and next up, we have a $10 super chat from Mike D, who says, I feel like the U.S. and its allies are helping just enough to keep a stalemate. We need to go all in. We have so many more weapon systems that we could that we could give to Ukraine to send Russia packing. What are your thoughts?
Could you reread the first part of that again, around the first sentence?
Yes, Mike says, I feel like the U.S. and its allies are helping just enough to keep a stalemate. We need to go all in.
All right, so I would agree. I would definitely agree. It seems like we're not sitting in enough. And I have seen the dumbest argument in the world, that the West is intentionally trying to keep the war going on forever, which wouldn't make a lot of sense because we tried to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan as fast as we could, and although we ended up being there 10 and 20 years, combined, we still tried to get out of there as fast as possible, and that was almost our goal ever since we were able to actually take over most of each of the countries. We were like, okay, how do we get out? And that's usually how wars are supposed to be fought. You're supposed to make them incredibly quick and get out. So I don't know why the West would have an advantage of keeping this war going on forever. That is, of course, damaging the Ukrainian economy, which could be a new market for a lot of Western goods and companies to enter after the war is over. And also, that's cutting out, while a lot of companies won't say it, that's cutting out a lot of Western companies from the Russian market as well, as they've completely withdrawn from it. So, in that regard, it's not really beneficial to anyone for a war to continue on forever. And so, the West is trying to end the war as fast as possible in terms of sending over supplies, but the problem is that there's enough political pressure going in the opposite direction in most countries that is making the supplies arrive either late or in small numbers and in small batches. So that's what a lot of countries are having to contend with right now, like the United States, and that's what's the holdup. If we can kind of get rid of that holdup, and just say, it's a kind of a long-term investment and it's at a pretty decent steal as well, just for perspective, the war in Afghanistan, at this point, I hate to say it because so many soldiers went over there and a couple of thousands of them did die and almost 10,000 were wounded or more. But we were over in Afghanistan for 22 years. And we ended up getting nothing out of it. It's returned to the exact state we left it in within the course of a year. And it cost us $2.3 trillion to get to that point. And I have not seen a single person bring up the fact that that war was incredibly overpriced and it did nothing. I've never seen anyone bring up that point. However, we do see people bringing up the point that sending $60 billion combined in support to Ukraine is just that final dollar that would save everyone. And I've heard this argument a pretty good bit from a lot of sides. This could fix homelessness. This could fix hunger. We could do so much with this. We could fix the roads. We could build new trains. And I'm going to say this, that money would have never been used for any of that stuff, and if it only took $60 billion to fix world hunger or poverty or something like that, why hasn't it been done yet? The answer is that it's an unfixable problem, and that money would have never done anything to solve it anyways. And so, $60 billion is, of course, a great investment to secure our interests in Eastern Europe, and also keep Ukraine from falling under the Russian sphere of influence. And so, in that regard, support should continue to go over at an incredibly fast rate because, the faster it goes over, the faster this war ends, the quicker we have to not care about it, just being honest. And so I do believe that we should be sending over even more support, and I will agree with you that it is being sent over there at a very slow pace, and if we were able to send over a larger amount of aid, it would definitely make a huge difference in turning the tide of the war early. And so with that, thank you very much once again for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we are going to move on to the next one, and I thank you once again for the support.
And next up, we have a $10 super chat from WL, who says, Ukraine needs more HIMARS.
And I would certainly agree. They do need more of them. I don't know if they really need HIMARS, maybe M270s, because they can carry 12 rockets instead of 6. But regardless, they need more HIMARS-like systems because they're doing a great job. We saw pretty much a single HIMARS take out every single strategic building in Donetsk over the course of a night. And if it can do that, if they had multiple of those across the entirety of the front lines, imagine what kind of damage they could wreak on the communications and logistic lines alone. The Russians would pretty much be in so much confusion with all lines, would be incredibly fragile. And so I do agree with you completely. They should send over more HIMARS. And with that, I thank you once again for the support. I hope that does answer the question. And also, I want to put this into perspective too, talking about the last comment that we covered before we moved on to this question. With Afghanistan costing $2.3 trillion for us to stay there for as long as we did, the interesting thing is that when you break down the cost, it cost us $230 million a day to stay in Afghanistan. So that means $1 billion of support to Ukraine would have kept us in Afghanistan for a whopping 3 days. Just to put that into perspective. Well, no, 2, 4, 6, 8. Nah, that would have really kept us in there for about 4 days, really. But still, imagine that. We're literally turning the tide of the war with just another $1 billion of support to Ukraine, or multiples of billions of dollars. And that kind of money would have been spent over the course of 4 days to keep the United States there. So that kind of puts it into perspective how cheap it is to actually help the Ukrainians turn the tide of this war and win. So with that, I hope that once again kind of adds on to my thoughts and kind of makes them a little bit more clear. And also, I hope I did address your question, well, your comment pretty well about sending over more HIMARS. And with that, we are on to the next question. And I thank y'all both once again for the support and the great comments and questions.
And moving on, we have a $10 super chat from Hoodoo, Texas, who says, how about a projection showing the possible Russian offensive, if it happens, to take the rest of the Donbas? What do the Russians need to do to meet Putin's objectives for taking the Donbas?
Let's see, if we were to say that, from the south, there's not really a lot of options. You see, they do have the Zaporizhzhia front line, but we saw that the offensive there completely petered out. It got stopped, and they didn't even make any ground. So I don't know what they would be able to do down here. But up here, we do know that they're getting really close to Slovyansk, as far as we know. And in the Izyum direction, I have heard and seen a little bit of indications that they have made ground beyond the city a couple of miles down, but not a lot. So if we were to go with the idea of them surrounding the rest of the Donetsk area, I think the front lines are going to get really wonky here, but hear me out. The Russians are going to continue the push from the Papasana area and reach Bakhmut, and they're going to try and move around the city, down the M03, and also down towards the T0504. And let me just draw up these lines so that way we can kind of get a clearer picture. Going to push down the road, and they're going to push towards Kostyantynivka right here. So let me try and get that. We'll call this Russian push. And then we'll color this line purple. Well, no, we'll actually color it brown. And we'll expand the width. Also, we'll get rid of these two supply line routes because Severodonetsk and Lysychansk aren't even in Ukrainian hands, so the supply line doesn't even really matter anymore. And then they'll be moving around Bakhmut towards Slovyansk. I still think they're going to try and go for that and move down the M03 in kind of an encirclement. So we'll draw up that line real quick towards this direction. Russian push. And this is all for illustration purposes. These lines will be taken down right after this. And once again, these are, my assumptions. This isn't exactly what the Russians might do, but it's a pretty good guesstimate, I guess you could say, of what I'm thinking they will do. They're going to try and push across the Seversky Donets River. Of course, probably not right on the highway. They'll probably try and create another bridge crossing. But they'll try and reach Slovyansk. And then from Slovyansk, they'll try and move down towards Kramatorsk. And there's going to be really no other option for them here, rather than to try and blunt force their way through both cities and literally just fight through them. They'll probably obliterate both of them in the process. But we'll put Russian push here. Ooh, whoa, what's that? I don't know what that was. Let me rename that. Sorry about that. And hang on just a second, everyone. Russian push. Like threw in a massive superlink. So let's get a color on that. A little bit of width. And so, yikes, I just don't know how they're going to do anything down here. Oh, wait a minute, I think I know how. Because if they were just able to move on these northern axes alone in the Donetsk Oblast, which is outlined by this little dotted line, that's the Donetsk Oblast that the Ukrainians still control, here's how they're most likely going to be able to do it. And this is just within the next 2 weeks of planning, if, you know, it went all to plan. The Russians would push out of Papasana. They would move around Bakhmut in the direction of the M03 towards Slovyansk and also near Kostyantynivka. Once they get to Kostyantynivka, they're going to be threatening the Ukrainian positions near Orlivka heavily, and so these Ukrainian forces will withdraw towards Kostyantynivka and try and set up a new defensive line there, along with Bakhmut. Although Bakhmut's almost going to be an unattainable position at that point. The Russians are then going to have free reign to move past the Ukrainian defensive positions that would have been here, kind of on the Ukrainian Maginot Line, and then move through New York and down onto the H-20, where they'll then move up and meet up the rest of the forces at Konstantinivka. The Russians that are moving up towards the Slovyansk region will be threatening the rest of the Ukrainians here near Seversk, and so they'll have to withdraw and try and move back towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. And if the Russians are ever able to push across the Seversk and Donets River, they'll of course set up multiple bridgeheads there, which will be a new supply hub and supply line for them to reach at a faster speed, and then they'll blunt force their way through Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. After they do that, they'll mostly control all of the major population areas within the Donetsk Oblast, except for Pokrovsk and Dobropilya, which are an incredibly far distance away from the rest of the larger cities there. But after they capture these two large settlements, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and also Bakhmut, which is a third one, but it's more of a minor population center, they'll pretty much control the majority of Donetsk population-wise. They won't control all the land, though. They'll have to try and go after that. And if we look at the topography of the land in the Donetsk region, it appears that it appears that the ridgelines move north to south, kind of like they do up here near Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in this area. And so I don't think that would be to the Ukrainians' advantage, necessarily. So I think it might be a tough fight for them if the Russians were able to do these plans here and then manage to capture Kramatorsk and then start moving south towards the remaining two large cities that would be within Donetsk. So in that regard, I think that would be my best guesstimation as to how the Russians would most likely be able to push the Ukrainians out of Donetsk and actually capture it. But then again, these are very bold and risky plans right here, and there's really not a good way for them to do it right now. But with that, I hope that does answer the question, and I thank you very much for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
All right, and up next we have a $10 super chat from Hole Lee, who says, "Hey Enforcer, have we seen any T-14 armadas in the conflict yet? Also, I love the content and love from a fellow historian."
And I thank you so much for the support, and the answer to that question is no. The Russians will never send a T-14 Armada to Ukraine, one, because they're still being tested, and two, they have a really small number of them. If we look at the actual number they have, let's see if we can find one on Wikipedia, at least a public number, we can see that only prototypes have been built, and if we can get a number, come on, where's the number? Where is the number? Y'all aren't going to give me a number? Lame. But I think the last number we got was somewhere around 14 of them, and so they have such a small number, and they're all prototypes still, that they're not going to be sent. We always see production model vehicles being used. You rarely ever see prototypes being used. And so with that, I hope that does answer the question, and I thank you once again for the support. And the short answer to that is no, and we probably never will. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question, and thank you once again.
All right, and up next we have a $10 super chat from Captain Chris1220, who says, "It's been a long day. I need one of those famous yeehaws from Matthew." And guess what? I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but yeehaw!
That one actually went through.
Oh, wow. What do you know? Guess what, Captain Chris? You got to hear the full yeehaw that was uncensored and unedited. So there you go. I hope that pleased you pretty good. Everybody should get a kick out of that. And with that being said, we are moving on to our next super chat, which is from Misdemeanor, who puts in a $20 donation and says, "How about sending over about 20 A-10 Warthogs? That should shake stuff up a great deal."
I would agree. That sounds like a really good idea, but I hate to say this because I'm a huge fan of the A-10 as well, but the A-10 is not as good as a lot of people have made it out to be. If we pull up air losses in the Gulf War, we go here, we'll see that wait, hold on. Let's just go to combat losses for the United States. So Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And let's go through here and let's count how many. Yeah, that's going to be too difficult because it's all listed separately. Let's see if we can just get one that kind of lays out a spreadsheet of which aircraft were lost. So, let's see. And this is one thing I love about the United States is that they never really fudge the numbers. They just kind of tell you what it was. And especially since it was 30 years ago, they really have no reason to lie. So that's the nice thing about looking at it from the past. But let's see. Main air campaign. What about the losses? Let's see. Total of 75 coalition aircraft, 52 fixed wing. But we were trying to figure out the number of A-10s that were lost in that, because I believe it was around a quarter or half of the air losses were A-10s. Let's see. Air losses go for by aircraft. So let's see if we can get that number. It looks like it's kind of tough to find. Let's see. By go for A-10. 5 A-10s were destroyed. 20 of these aircraft returned with significant damage, and 45 returned with light damage that was repaired between sorties. Maybe I'm thinking of the invasion of Iraq. Let me pull that up, because I know that there was a decent amount of air losses that were taken by A-10s, more so than any other model of aircraft in the U.S. inventory. Invasion of Iraq. Let's see, Iraq. Let's see here. Oh man, they're gonna make this as hard as possible to find, aren't they? Man, I'm disappointed in this. Anyways, it does seem like a good idea, but by and large, while a lot of people think that the A-10 is incredibly armored, the thing is that the armor, that's this titanium bathtub that everyone's always talking about, only protects the pilot. It doesn't really protect any of the critical, like, I guess you could call it, what would you say? Critical systems on the plane, like the flight controls and things like that, engines and such. It doesn't protect that. It only protects the pilot. And so its armor only extends to the pilot, and it's actually a pretty easy aircraft to shoot down, kind of like how the Ka-52 was thought to have been an invincible armored tank that was a flying helicopter, and then the Ukrainians have been shooting them down like nothing. So I would agree that it would be cool to send over the A-10s, but their effectiveness would be heavily questionable, considering that the Russians are using S-400s and S-300s, which are very competent anti-air systems, and then the A-10 is a very slow, very big aircraft that would most likely get shot down by an S-400. So with that, I hope that does answer the question. I hope that something can be sent over that will help out the Ukrainians a lot. But sadly, I just don't think the A-10 is the one for the job. But then again, I could be wrong. The A-10s, of course, keep on being left in service by the Air Force and the Department of Defense, because they do their job rather well. But they generally do it off of the guided munitions that they're able to use. And then when you get into that arena, any aircraft in the U.S. Air Force can use most of the guided munitions that the A-10 can. And so with that, I hope that does answer the question. Thank you once again for the support, and we're going to move on to the next question.
All right, and next up, we have a $10 super chat from Notorious GRG, who says, "Some moolah today helps keep the DDoS away."
And thank you very much for the support and also the rhyme. And of course, it does help us out a lot, because, you know, if we, well, it doesn't really help out with the DDoS, but it does help us to keep running these streams, which kind of helps out with the DDoSes, I guess you could say. And so with that, I thank you once again for the support. And I see a lot of people saying the A-10s are great, the A-10s are good, but if you ever look at their statistics, they're not that great. And on top of that, I also saw someone give an example of them being used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm going to tell you this, the Iraqis nor the Afghans had S-300s or S-400s. That's also why you saw AC-130s flying in Afghanistan, and even at that, it was so risky to fly those, even in Afghanistan against literal tribesmen, that they would have to fly them at night, so that way they didn't have the possibility of getting shot down. So, while they're cool, because I know that everyone's always into the A-10, and I gotta agree, it's a cool plane, and it looks pretty good, statistically, I would have to go and pull up all the figures, but it's not that great. I'll tell you that. The gun can't even penetrate it can't penetrate any modern armor. It has to only target soft vehicles. So, you know, that's kind of why I was able to succeed in Afghanistan, because if you use the A-10, you were literally using it against like 10 guys up on a mountain with some AKs, you know, or you're using it against a mud wadi, you know, or something like that. You weren't using it against a Russian T-72, which is backed up by S-400 anti-air systems well in the background, and then this thing also has to have altitude to use its guided weapons, which of course exposes it on the radar, you know, and so the S-400s will pick it up and shoot it down. So you know, while it's cool and the burst from the gun is really neat and it does have a lot of hard points and carry a lot of munitions, it's not the ideal aircraft for an actual conventional modern war. It's going to find itself heavily outclassed, and I know a lot of people are going to laugh at that, but also a lot of people laughed at me when I said Ukraine was going to last longer than a week, and we're now rounding out the 18th week and moving into the 19th one. So, I'm not saying I'm always right, but in this instance, I would actually bet money on the A-10 wouldn't do as well as people are expecting. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question, but I hope that kind of does address my opinions on the A-10.
All right, and the next super chat is from Blue Neptune, who puts in a $10 donation and says, "You guys, awesome reporting. Has great constitution. Ukraine's ammo, or ammo, I think they meant to say, is on the way. We just are slow. I'm sure lots of politics involved. Sad."
Well, I thank you very much for the support, and I thank you so much for the nice words there. Now, it was in a little bit of broken English, but that doesn't ever stop the try. It's always worth a good college try, and we did get the message through it. And I do have to agree that we have been sending over as much supplies as possible, but I don't know about the logistical quagmire. We're always hearing about it, but I've never seen a lot of video evidence to back it up. And I'm just going to say this, okay? CNN, as far as I know, is one of the few news organizations that showed the supposed supply backup. They also talked about how in Puerto Rico, during a certain hurricane, no supplies had been sent down there to help them out, and they literally took that video on the news in a warehouse filled with supplies that had been sent in, and the warehouse was literally filled up to the roof. So, you know, I'm just going to say the people who have been saying this thing about the supply shortage in Puerto Rico also are saying the same thing about the supply bottleneck in Ukraine. And whether it's true or not, I'm not really sure. But then again, I don't have any information to prove it wrong or right. So hopefully there is no bottleneck. And if there is, hopefully it can be sorted out by a combined effort both by the NATO countries like Poland and the United States, along with all the other countries, as well as Ukraine, to try and get it in there quicker, because the quicker it gets in, the better off Ukraine is. And so with that, I hope that does answer the question, and I thank you once again for the support, and with that, we're on to the next one.
And next up, let me recognize a $20 super chat from Homer Lapgard. Thank you very much for that. He does not leave a comment, but we appreciate your support, and thank you for watching the channel. And next up, we have a $10 super chat from B. Dobson, who says, "Mr. Me said Poland should annex Ukraine and spin Russian tactics against them."
Say what? Can you read that again?
He said, "Mr. Me said Poland should annex Ukraine and spin Russian tactics against them."
Do you know who Mr. Me is?
I'm not really sure.
I thank you for the support. I don't think it'd be a good idea for Poland to annex Ukraine. That would, of course, be dissolving the government in Ukraine, so Zelensky and them would be put out of power, and that would be pretty much like declaring war on them in another way and doing exactly what the Russians are trying to do, which is annex Ukraine. So I'd see where you're coming from, but I wouldn't really agree with that, because that would kind of make Ukraine cease to exist as a country, and they would probably never return. So with that, I thank you once again for the support. I hope that does address the question. I know the sentiments and where you're coming from, but as an actual policy or a thing to do, I wouldn't necessarily back that up. But with that, we're on to the next one, and I thank you once again for the support.
Okay, so I think I got some clarification. It looks like Mr. Me is a viewer, and he just clarified what he intended to say. He said, "Could Ukraine just join Poland or some other neighboring NATO country, loophole in and then leave later? That would be a good neighbor move," is what I said.
What? Oh, okay. Now that we got a little bit of clarification, NATO does not work like that. You can't ally with a neighbor, per se, and then become a member of NATO through a loophole. If you want to become a member of NATO, it has to be approved by every single member in the alliance, and so there is really no loophole around it. Every nation would have to convene and say yes to that. And so Poland couldn't really just like slide them into NATO with like a little shoehorn and just shove them in there. While that's a great idea, sadly it just wouldn't work through the NATO charter, because it's not written that way. But it is a great idea, but sadly that just wouldn't work. So with that, I hope that does answer the question once again. And I thank you for clarifying that, because it does give us a better idea of what the question was and how to answer it. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question. And thank you once again for the support.
And next up, we have a $10 super chat from Tito McLovin, who says, if Musk bought the Carl Zeiss Corporation and ASML, the USA would no longer need TSMC and could potentially be dominant for the next 1,000